Why did some Japanese soldiers keep fighting after World War II ended? Welcome back to the Stuff You Should Think About, the podcast where we take everyday questions, strange facts, and fascinating topics, and we break them down in just a few minutes. Today's question is: how could some Japanese soldiers keep fighting for decades after World War II had already ended? World War II officially ended in 1945. Japan surrendered. The fighting stopped. Millions of soldiers laid down their weapons and returned home. But not everyone got the message, or perhaps more accurately, not everyone believed it. Scattered across remote islands in the Pacific were Japanese soldiers who had been trained with one simple belief: never surrender. But many of them, surrender wasn't just considered a military defeat, it was considered dishonorable. They had been taught that capture was worse than death, that loyalty to the emperor meant fighting until the very end. So when the war ended, some soldiers simply refused to believe it. One of the most famous examples is Lieutenant Haru Onoda. In 1944, Onoda was sent to Lumbang Island in the Philippines with orders to conduct guerrilla warfare. His commanding officer gave him very specific instructions. Do not surrender. Do not take your own life. Keep fighting until ordered otherwise. When Japan surrendered in 1945, aircraft dropped leaflets announcing that the war was over. Onoda found them, but he believed they were enemy propaganda. More leaflets followed, newspapers, letters from family, even loudspeakers. Still, he remained convinced it was all part of an elaborate trick to lure him out of hiding. For years, he and a small group of soldiers survived in the jungle. They ate bananas, coconuts, wild plants, and occasionally cattle they stole from nearby farms. They repaired their uniforms, maintained their rifles, avoided search parties, and continued carrying out attacks because they believed the war was still being fought. As years passed, his group became smaller. Some surrendered, some were killed, some more than likely said, "You're crazy, the hell with this." Eventually, Onoda was alone. Yet, he continued following the last orders he had received nearly 30 years earlier. Finally, in 1974, a Japanese adventurer named Norio Suzuki traveled to Lumbang Island specifically to find him. Remarkably, he succeeded. But Onoda still refused to surrender. He insisted he would only obey a direct order from his commanding officer. The Japanese government tracked down his former commander, who was now retired and working as a bookseller. The former officer flew to the Philippines. Standing in the jungle almost 3 decades after the war had ended, he officially relieved Onoda of his duties. Only then did Onoda surrender. He emerged wearing his military uniform, carrying his rifle, hundreds of rounds of ammunition, hand grenades, and the sword he had carried throughout the war. His rifle was still operational. His discipline had never faded. But Onoda wasn't the only holdout. Another soldier, Shoichi Yokoi, was discovered on the island of Guam in 1972. Unlike Onoda, Yoki spent much of his time hiding rather than fighting. He survived by fishing, trapping small animals, and weaving clothing from tree bark. He lived in an underground shelter he had built with his own hands for 27 years. When local hunters finally discovered him, Yokoi reportedly said, "It is with much embarrassment that I return." Those words reflected the military culture he had grown up with. To him, surviving while the war had ended wasn't something to celebrate. It was something he found deeply shameful. So why didn't these soldiers simply believe the evidence? Part of the answer lies in psychology. When people commit themselves completely to a belief, especially under extreme conditions, changing that belief becomes incredibly difficult. Imagine spending years that every stranger is trying to deceive you. Every leaflet, every newspaper, every radio broadcast. Eventually, even the truth begins to look like another lie. Isolation made it even worse. These soldiers had no reliable way to verify information. No television, no internet, no trusted news sources. Only occasional encounters with people they believed were the enemy. Their world had frozen in 1945. Meanwhile, the real world moved on. People landed on the moon. Television became common. Computers were invented. Entire generations grew up. Yet in the jungles of the Pacific, a handful of soldiers still believe World War II was still being fought. Today, their stories are studied not because they change history, but because they reveal something about human nature. They show the incredible power of loyalty, the danger of unquestioned beliefs, and the lengths people will go to fulfill what they believe is their duty. It's easy to wonder how someone could stay hidden for decades. But perhaps the more interesting question is, how powerful must an idea be for someone to dedicate nearly 30 years of their life to it? Whether you see these men as heroes, tragic figures, or something in between, their stories remain among the most remarkable chapters of World War II. And they're definitely something worth thinking about. Thanks for listening to the Stuff You Should Think About. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow the podcast and join us next time, where we'll answer another question you probably never thought to ask, but you definitely should.